Good afternoon, Realtors. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sharon Stone, your SCR Communications Director. With us today, we have Dr. Dan Vallero. Dr. Vallero is an internationally recognized author and expert in environmental science and engineering. He has devoted decades to conducting research, teaching, and mentoring future scientists and engineers. He's currently developing tools and models to predict potential exposures to chemicals in consumer products. In addition to his 46 years with the EPA, he has served on the science staff of the U.S. House of Representatives and is a full adjunct professor of civil and environmental engineering at Duke University's Pratt School of Engineering. He received his PhD from Duke University and master's degrees from the University of Kansas and Southern Illinois University. Dr. Vallero is here with us today to talk about what realtors need to know about asbestos. Thanks for being here with us today, Dr. Vallero. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Appreciate it. Well, actually, this could be what everybody, not just real estate people, need to know, but I think you have a special role as real estate professionals in protection of building materials in general, which is, although a lot of my research now is on consumer product exposure, ingredients in consumer products, we're also doing work in building materials, and that's going to become a greater emphasis as with EPA in the years ahead. But today I am going to be talking about asbestos. I'm with the Center for Computational Toxicology and Exposure, so we do a lot of modeling, but we rely heavily on measurement too. So I will talk a little bit about some of the challenges we're having right now in measuring particulate matter, elongate particulate matter in particular, and asbestos as a type of elongate particulate matter. The views that I'm going to talk about today are mine. I'm sure many of my colleagues in EPA share them, but we want to make sure that this is a scientific presentation. And so if you have questions about policy or regulation, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with the people at EPA who know a lot more about those things than I do. So basically, let's talk about, so we're all kind of on the same page. What is asbestos? Well, asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral. It's a mineral is basically made up of magnesium, silicon, and oxygen. Every one of those, every asbestos fiber has one, but it occurs in nature. We find it in igneous and metamorphic rock formations usually, and when we use the term asbestos, it's really a legal term. It's a kind of an official term. So there are many fibers out there that may be just as toxic and just as dangerous as the 6 fibers that are defined as asbestos. But most of what you're going to hear about in almost every country, the United States, but as well as most other countries, are 6 particular fiber types. Chrissa Tile is the one that I've worked with more extensively, and it is probably the most common of the types of fibers. It is one of the it has less persistence, but that doesn't mean it's not persistent. It's highly persistent. All asbestos fibers are asbestos, both in the environment and particularly when they get into your lung tissue. Amosite, carcinolite, anthophyllite, tremolite, and actinolite are the other 5. And you'll see usually Chrissa Tile separated from amphiboles in the literature. So Chrissa Tile and amosite, carcinolite and amosite, for example, are amphiboles. And so if you're a geologist or a mineralogist, those are important distinctions. To us, the distinctions are usually things like the size, the length of the fiber, and the diameter of the fiber. And there are, as I mentioned, a whole group of different kinds of fibers that are not included in asbestos class that may have similar toxicities and exposure profiles to these. The reason we see so much asbestos are the features that early in the 20th century were seen as being really a benefit. In fact, asbestos was seen as sort of a miracle fiber because you could weave it. It was heat resistant, fire resistant. It was an excellent insulator, and it strengthened a lot of materials. For example, some of the work that one of my colleagues at EPA worked at a floor manufacturing facility before he came to EPA, and that's where I learned that actually it's more like the rebar. So it gives you tensile strength, it gives you strength for things like floor tiles and roofing material. So even though it did have this extra bonus of being fire resistant, it was often used because it allowed for strength in the materials. However, the downside is once it's inhaled or ingested, it usually is often trapped in the body. So it's very difficult for the body to remove through the natural process, the biological process, these fibers. As I mentioned, it is persistent both in the environment and once it enters an organism, and it's resistant to degradation. So once it's there, it doesn't break down readily. In fact, it can usually remains in the tissue for decades. So that means that both the chronic, in my field, we basically, in the exposure field, we look at things as acute, subchronic, and chronic, the exposure. So an acute exposure would be an exposure you have maybe a single dose. Subchronic might be something between 1 year and 7 years of exposure. And then chronic would be something greater than 7 years. However, for asbestos, you can have, very few exposures because the latency period is so long and the persistence is so high, the toxicity can result. So you could have an exposure that may occur decades earlier and not really yield any type of toxicological effect for decades. As a result, you have inflammation, scarring, and genetic changes. And by that, we'll talk about the three different kind of diseases that we mainly are profoundly associated with asbestos exposures. But the type of inflammation, where it is, the type of scarring, and the damage that's done will vary by the type of fiber that you're exposed to. I'm going to very quickly go through some risk management requirements because I do work for a regulatory agency. Obviously, EPA is a regulatory agency. We're a funding agency, and we're also a research agency. I'm in the research part, but there are so many laws. Here is probably the biggest one, Toxic Substance Control Act, the Clean Air Act. They all regulate asbestos in different ways. Recently, TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, was amended a couple of years ago, and there's a new Section 6 requires that EPA take actions to address chemicals. Asbestos are included in those chemicals that pose unreasonable risk to human health or the environment. And for asbestos, it's generally human health, and it's an unreasonable risk with association of these 6 different types of fibers. Well, after that determination, which has been made for asbestos, in particular Chrissa Tile, I'm on the Chrissa Tile committee, for example. EPA has to issue a rule that the chemical no longer presents unreasonable risk. So there's a timeline between that designation of unreasonable risk and what EPA has to do to make that happen. So we look in, for example, gaskets and things like that are being manufactured still in the United States and certainly used in manufacturing processes. We have to find alternatives to those that are safer and get that done as quickly as possible. So we are currently for the Chrissa Tile rule that is out right now for public review. The options that are available to us are often that we can prohibit, limit, even ban. In the case of asbestos, I think most of that has been banned, but there are a few types of chloralkali industry, for example, makes heavy use of the gaskets, and it's very difficult, right? One of the challenges we have is finding a way to upgrade these facilities without putting them out of business, because you need the chloralkali business for things like water treatment, safe water, and so forth. The prohibitions, the minimum warnings and instructions, there's all kinds of rules on this, record keeping, monitoring, testing, and the regulation that in both commercial use and disposal. Asbestos is another law that's that you'll see asbestos, and I think you'll probably come in contact with. It's the Superfund law. So many of the national priority listed Superfund sites contain asbestos, and so you want to be very careful if you're involved in any kind of old waste sites to make sure that there's not any remaining asbestos containing material there. So the disposal becomes a very important point. And then the actual, again, the what happens after these unreasonable risk determinations are made. Basically, that's all I'm going to say about it because I'm a researcher. And there, as I mentioned, though, if there's any aspect of the regulation of asbestos that you're interested in, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with some of my colleagues in the program offices and who regulate asbestos. So the first type, and the type that I'm most familiar with, is Chrissa Tile. It's most common. It's been widely used for many purposes, and where you'll probably encounter it is in older homes that in up to 80s, 90s. A lot of the homes used this. A lot of the building materials used in homes were found in the walls, roofs, ceilings, and floors. You'll often see it in this is one of the major problems in schools, for example, where you see insulation around pipes, ducts, and appliances. It's also used in manufacturing for, as I mentioned, for brake linings, gaskets, and seals. It is more persistent than the amphiboles are. It's less persistent than the amphiboles are. And some of these are the amosite is also found in building materials like cement sheets and pipe insulation, and in ceiling tiles and thermal insulation products. Carcinolite is a manufacturing, often a manufacturing process of steam engines, but it's also used in coatings and again insulation. And antipholite is a limited use, but so you may not encounter it, but you may encounter it in naturally occurring asbestos sites around the country. There are some in South Carolina. And it also, again, in homes, it's also co-occurs with Carcinolite, as Carcinolite was, as Chrissa Tile was used. It will it possibly will show up in vermiculite insulation materials in attics, for example. And it has been, I think there are court cases going on right now about its association in talc. Tremolite and actinolite are not used commercially, but you will find it co-occurring again with Chrissa Tile, and so you probably would see it in naturally occurring asbestos sites. The types of diseases that we have associated with them are, the one that's probably the most widely known is asbestosis, although recently the mesothelioma has gotten a lot more attention. But asbestosis is a scarring of the tissue, and basically what happens is that the body's phagocytosis processes that to remove the asbestos don't work very well with the longer fiber, and so they can't really the body's immune system can't really encapsulate the fiber, and so as a result, you kind of toxify yourself. There are other pleural diseases, and mesothelioma is a pleural disease, but it's a cancer. There are non-cancer disease associated with the pleural damage. Lung cancer, and again, I'll have a little graph that I'll show you that associates the size and the length and size of the fiber and how it's associated with these different kinds of diseases. But lung cancer, in some ways, it's very similar to other types of particulate matter, where the smaller fibers tend to infiltrate the respiratory system in a much more deeper way, and as a result, your removal processes don't work as nearly as well as with the further penetration into the lung. Mesothelioma is probably the one that is the scariest because you hear a lot about it, but also it's very common with certain types of fiber asbestos exposure. And it is in the pleural area, as I mentioned, and the membrane lining in the abdominal cavity, and the membrane surrounding internal organs. And then more recently, I've actually worked up in Minnesota, worked in the taconite area, where there's been some epidemiology done up there where we're seeing other diseases besides the lung diseases, particularly things like cardiovascular, which could be the result of, that all these systems are interconnected. So as you stress the respiratory system, you can also stress the other systems. So just to give you an idea of how there is some dissimilarity among the different fiber types, these are electron micrographs from 2018, where you see that the Carcinolite, the Carcinolite and the anthracite are much more kind of brittle needle-like shapes, and these are the amphiboles. Whereas the Chrissa Tile tends to be a longer, although they can break and they can certainly be shorter and behave a little more like a spherical particle. But they're more these kind of curly, interwoven serpentine types of asbestos. I should say something about, I don't mention this in the presentation, and I should have probably, is that the way we define a fiber is actually kind of a bone of contention among the scientific community. Generally, we define any fiber as something that has an aspect ratio of 3:1. In other words, its length to its width its length is at least 3 times longer than its width. Although we debate the problem with the problem within the scientific community is there's debate that, well, maybe the ones that we really should draw the line at is 20:1, the really long fibers. And again, it depends on what disease you're more concerned about. So aspect ratio is something you'll see often, and so in the literature, and so, but generally the general rule is that something has to be at least 3:1 in an aspect ratio. So as I mentioned, both the fiber length and the fiber diameter become very important when you look at the etiology of disease, and also in my business, where I've some of the work I've done earlier in my career was looking at the ability to detect the different fibers. And so it's interesting, if you actually you collect it on a filter, and a lot of these fibers get infiltrate far into the filter, and you may not actually see them with optical methods. So something like phase contrast microscopy isn't nearly as powerful as the electron microscopy and transmission electron microscopy. But even that, you need to. One of the studies we did is we showed that you need to spend a lot of time etching. We usually catch these on cellulose fibers. And so if you don't etch long enough, you don't burn off the filter, you'll miss a lot. So we actually did that study, and we never did. We kept seeing more and more filters even after 15 minutes or so of times where we've done etching. So there's a lot of uncertainty within the scientific community when you start getting down to how many fibers actually are there floating around in the air. And we've gotten better at it, but it's still a challenge. And so this is something that when you hire somebody to check for the detection of the particular asbestos fibers you're interested in, make sure you know what kind of technology they're using. For example, you can see here that in the brown area, what's detected is they actually detect the longer and the larger diameter fibers much better than they do. The blue areas actually detects all the way back to pretty small, although there is a non-detect. We always have a non-detect problem. So just because something is not detected doesn't mean it's zero fibers. So, but we're better with TEM, but we are always trying to improve that. And you can see basically, if you see the left hash, if you see the legend down at the bottom, mesothelioma usually occurs in a longer fiber, but a thinner fiber. Whereas the lung cancer tends to occur more often with a long fiber, but a thicker fiber diameter. And the asbestosis kind of occurs in a wider range of these fibers. Again, they have to be long enough that the body can't remove the fiber, but they can actually be quite a bit in thickness. So you can see that the type of fiber causes different kinds of diseases, whether it's asbestosis, lung cancer, or mesothelioma. I looked at the real estate exam, and there is something on asbestos containing. So there's 2 areas that I think are important to real estate professionals. There's several, but the 2 I think most are important are naturally occurring asbestos, because that's where a building site, you want to make sure it's not in the site that you're building, but also asbestos containing materials. And asbestos containing materials is on one of your test questions. So you might want to bone up on that a little bit. But basically an asbestos containing material is a term that refers to the material containing more than 1%. So again, arbitrary number doesn't mean 0.5% is still going to be a problem. But by definition, the ACM includes only those that are 1% or higher. However, there's another distinction. That's whether the material is friable. The asbestos in the material is friable. In other words, it's released into the air and breathable. And so a friable asbestos containing material again contains 1% by weight or area, but it's a different kind of material in that it can be crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to a powder, so that it is now released and into the air. So it's an potential air exposure. Non-friable means kind of the opposite, that you can do these things to it, but it doesn't get released. So the friable is the much more dangerous type of fiber. There's a further distinction are those that are regulated. So the regulated ACM, all the friables are regulated, but also anything that could potentially become friable, even though you're squeezing it and you're trying to crush it, and it doesn't necessarily become a powder. If over time it's suspected of doing that, it's also regulated, and it's anything that has the high probability over time, given different kinds of environmental condition, so that a lot of fiber is considered to be regulated. You'll see it often, in addition to building and siding, you'll also see it in demolition. So, for example, I know there's a lot of infilling type work done in different neighborhoods and so forth. One thing that I would be worried about is not only whether there was actually asbestos in any kind of product that was there in the meantime, between when it was built and when it was actually being demolished for your infilling. The demolition process has its own regulations associated with it. So under Superfund, the comprehensive hazardous waste law, and also the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, which is another hazardous waste. So those two laws, you want to make sure that the demolition meets those requirements. And also the Clean Air Act. There's a national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, NESHAPs, that asbestos is included. All 6 fibers are included as hazardous air pollutants. You may actually see it in the vermiculite that's used in the attic. And the interesting thing about vermiculite, you may have heard of the Libby, Montana site, where it was a horrible site. So many people died as a result of being exposed to asbestos at the site. But there was also a lot of the vermiculite material that was mined there ended up all over the country. So you have sort of a non-stochastic exposure that occurs randomly throughout the North America, wherever the vermiculite that was mined there found its way into insulation. So, and that's not the only source of insulation that contains asbestos. Interesting, it's also found in paint, roofing materials. So basically, depending on the age of the home, you want to make sure that the ACM is not present, and that means that you're going to need to often contact experts. The environmental audits are really useful. Insurance companies often require them, as you probably already know. As far as the only thing I'll say about naturally occurring asbestos is that we've made a lot of mistakes and everybody, federal government's made mistakes when they've, for example, put pathways in parks and so forth where naturally occurring asbestos is present. And so here basically are the kind of the high probability areas where you really need to make sure that a virgin property, for example, that you start doing any kind of excavation or removal of material, that in the process you're not exposing people during that construction process, but also subsequent development that lead where people may live there, and for example, children may be in a park, or they may be in a backyard of a home where the material that was actually fairly stable has been destabilized as a result of development. So the green areas show these igneous and metamorphic terrains where it's very possible that there are asbestos, amphibole and Chrissa Tile types of asbestos associated with them that may be stable but can be destabilized pretty easily as you start pulling in the bulldozers, or even something as simple as digging a garden, for example. In fact, we've done studies where we've had activity related monitoring going. I put monitors on people. Of course, they're in hazardous hazmat suits, but they just to see what kind of friability there is in the materials, but also how much it actually makes into the breathing zone with different types of activities and gardening and so forth. So gardening actually showed it pretty high because the person is actually closer to the soil, and as they disturb it, anything that's friable, their exposure's much higher than, say, an activity like riding a bike. You can see that the igneous areas actually do cover the northwestern part of South Carolina, and so it is possible that you will. There is some vulnerability there. Also, the yellow dots is associated with these asbestos-formed minerals that are there. So you can see there's an area in the Appalachian area uplift where there is a possibility of asbestos-formed minerals. So if you're these aren't the only places where you may run into naturally occurring asbestos, but those are certainly the ones where the probability is much higher. So basically, I'd like to leave the rest of the time for questions and any kind of information that maybe I've touched on that you'd like a little more information. So by all means, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Dr. Vallero, there are a couple of questions.
Okay.
Someone said, what years, and I guess what homes, the years of the homes being built, should we be concerned with?
I think anything from the before 1980 and earlier, although I could probably get you more specific information on that, where we were becoming aware. If you actually look at the World Trade Center, for example, when they were building the World Trade Center, during the construction, they stopped using asbestos on certain floors. So I actually worked on the post-attack type monitoring up there. We had a lot of portable monitoring, and one of the things we looked at was the amount of asbestos was released, and a lot of it was released from all of it was released from the lower floors. So somewhere along the way in the 70s, with TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, and some other things, there became an awareness that building materials contained way too much of asbestos, and it wasn't necessarily just because it was being regulated, but people were becoming aware, and there were alternatives being requested. So sometime before 1980, the likelihood goes way up that there are asbestos containing materials in a home.
Thank you. Also, is there any type of test that can be done to see if you have exposure to asbestos?
Yes. So that, again, that's something that it varies by the type of exposure. For example, I've been working with the folks in our Atlanta regional office and our Seattle regional office to develop a method for soil. So soil to atmosphere, the type of entrainment of a fiber. And so we do have methods. EPA has been developing methods for different kinds of exposure scenarios. Asbestos in schools, for example, there is a method for determining the amount of fibers, and I'm at one time, I think it still is, you would actually use a leaf blower and go into the room and just see, for example, with radiators and so forth, and see how much friable materials get entrained into the atmosphere, and measure that. And the way you measure it, again, is using a filter. It's a cellulose type filter. So there's a methodology. EPA, and I could certainly send you that. The EPA has methodologies for different kinds of potential exposures. And generally, the exposure, there are three types of pathways for exposures to really anything. There's inhalation, ingestion, and dermal. And dermal doesn't seem to be there really isn't a lot of literature on asbestos and dermal, whereas some like PFAS, for example, the perfluoride types of things you've probably been hearing about. We're doing work right now on better dermal models, for example, for PFAS. Asbestos, it's generally inhalation is the main one. And there's a method for determining potential inhalation exposure. And then ingestion is often with drinking water, although you could have reentrained fibers onto food and so forth. But generally, drinking water, the Safe Drinking Water Act has a maximum contaminant level for asbestos. So asbestos is one of the things that you want to make sure that water doesn't contain. And drinking water doesn't contain, and then, but mainly it's atmospheric exposure. So the ambient under the naturally occurring asbestos sites, you look at ambient exposure, and then asbestos containing materials, you look at near field indoor exposure. Usually are the two that are mainly looked at, and every one of those has a different method. So you'd want to. And that's really a good question, because you do want to make sure you match the type of measurement with the type of exposure that's potential, the potential exposure in that scenario.
Thank you for that. Kelly asks, locally, who should realtors reach out to for inspections? Does this require a certification?
Yeah, I would start with my local health department in my county, the county health department. But again, EPA's there, and you can certainly contact us. But I think the closer you are to your local government, so state, their state and your local government, they have a lot more knowledge of your particular area. So for example, when I showed my where it's potentially exposed, where you potentially may be exposed, the high potential exposure areas for asbestos, those are big swaths of the United States, and every one of those counties, and even at towns and subdivisions, they vary. So for example, California had a lot of naturally occurring asbestos sites because of not only because of the geology, but also because so much growth was occurring. So there are areas that were basically undeveloped for forever were being developed, and in a matter of time, all these naturally occurring asbestos sites. Colorado also had some of those problems. So the people who are closest to it, as I mentioned, the county health departments, for example, would be probably the first place I would go.
Okay. Can you encapsulate asbestos siding on a home with another type of siding?
Well, I don't know if you could do it. No, I think when you encapsulate, you have to actually encapsulate the fiber. So I think if you just put another siding, another material over it, it's still there and could become friable if it isn't already friable. So there is an encapsulation process. There's also a removal process, and you really have to get a certified. You only use a certified, EPA certified type of removal company, because you could actually make things a lot worse by, again, disturbing insulation material that might have been easily removed. There's a wet removal process, dry removal processes, and encapsulation process where you basically put like a plastic material around it and make sure you stabilize it. But again, that can only be done, must only be done by certified removal and abatement types of companies. So you don't really want to just cover it up with another building material. You want to make sure that the fiber itself is either removed or encapsulated in a regulatorily acceptable way.
Okay, so I guess kind of along the same lines, Jim was asking, would it be fair to say acoustic ceiling materials with 0.5% Chrissalite are safe to scrape off the ceilings and discard?
Yeah, it's not, so that's why I say it's a 0.5%. That's the problem when you do a threshold, right?
Mhm.
Is that it's your exposure. Say, for example, I mean, it's just basic math. If I have 50 pounds of 1% and 100 pounds of 0.5%, I've got the same amount of ACM, right? So the same amount of asbestos. So yeah, I think it's more of definitional type things that the regulatory people do, but from an exposure standpoint, any asbestos, if there's a certain amount, if there's any asbestos, all right, any asbestos, if it's been detected, and you can see that detection can go down fairly well depending on what kind of methodology you use. You really want to be I would treat it as if it were a 1%. And I would follow the same RACM requirements, the regulated asbestos containing materials, just because it's just a matter of time before that 1% becomes a 0.5%, and that 0.5% becomes 0.1. So if just to be careful and really just to make sure that people aren't exposed, I would treat any detected amount of asbestos as if it were ACM.
Okay. So Elizabeth was asking if she should be concerned about a house with asbestos shingles if they have been painted and are left alone.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what painting. Just see, this is part of the problem that, even if you look at EPA's recommendations, we say things like ordinary. We use terms that are very unscientific. So if it's stable right now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be stable. I mean, we just had a hurricane in Florida, right? So you may think that it's stable under ordinary conditions. I'm doing air quotes in case you're not looking. So I would say if I know there's asbestos, again, I would consult an expert. If I actually know that these are asbestos containing tiles, I would consult an expert and say, is it sufficiently stable? Under what conditions does it remain stable? And that's why things like, ordinary don't really mean a lot to me as a scientist, because I know that I can have 100-year probability weather event occur tomorrow. So I don't think there's really a good rule of thumb for if there's asbestos material in that home, particularly on something like a roofing material where it's exposed to the elements, that how I can't really tell you how stable that will remain a day from now, certainly not 10 years from now. I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but I just assume with asbestos that the more we learn about it and the more if it's present, it's never a good thing. So I would say contact an expert and have them tell you how stable it is.
Gotcha. So any asbestos, you need to be on the lookout and have a professional come in and look at that.
That's a good, I think that's just a good policy, because we live in a litigious society too, right? So I'm not a lawyer,
right?
But I'm around a lot of them.
Yeah.
And so from a scientific perspective, just from a probability perspective, a mathematical probability perspective, something can go wrong, and you don't want to be the one that advised somebody that it was safe. We never say anything is safe. You probably know that when you deal with us, right? but we can give you a probability, if we think about it properly. We actually do a site-specific analysis of that home or that site or that development. We can give you some kind of a good idea of what it would take for that material to become friable, or that material to be for a potential exposure. And that's what I do, is I do models. And a model is only as good as the measurement data, the data that I put into it, but it's also only as good as the algorithms and the assumptions I make. So if I'm making an assumption that the weather's going to be, stay within these kinds of conditions, and I have these kinds of, and droughts are this rare, and wet periods are this rare, and I can put all that information in, that's still not very satisfying if you had one major event, right?
Mhm.
So that's why you really need to contact, you really need to be in touch with somebody that's a certified expert in this area.
Mhm. So there's a lot of specific questions. I don't think that we can address a few of these because they're pretty on the legal side, and we don't have any lawyers on the call presently.
Yeah, right.
So if you have any questions, guys, that are specific to forms or legal questions, feel free to call the hotline.
Call the hotline, or call, or if you do have a specific question, by all means, you can email me,
Mhm.
and I will certainly try to get you in touch with a person at EPA.
Right. And we have our team of lawyers here at SER as well. So if
Yeah.
you guys have specific questions on SER forms or specific instances and questions that are specific to a certain situation, then feel free to reach out to Byron or Austin or Tierra. They're always happy to answer your calls. So one of these other questions, I know you had mentioned, I guess, certain dates, timeframes where asbestos was more commonly used. Lisa is asking, what year did they stop using asbestos in popcorn ceilings? She said she heard it was as recent as 1994.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of testing available?
I don't know the exact time, but yes, some of these things, they hung on long after the health data were in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the, in fact, as I mentioned, I'm on a Chrissa Tile subcommittee for EPA, one of the TSCA, the 6C, they call it the 6C committee. And I'm amazed that we still have so much asbestos being used in commercial and manufacturing operations that, it's like, I keep asking, well, how do we justify that? And you do come back with, we have economists at EPA. And so they have a certain kind of perspective, and we have scientists and we have regulators. And so it really did vary. It does vary by, for example, we still have some asbestos containing gaskets that are used, right? So the reason is, there's a lot of reasons behind it, but one of them is that you do this cost effectiveness analyses, and you look at, health effectiveness, and basically say, well, you hope that popcorn ceiling, whatever the reason, popcorn ceiling is going to be fairly stable, and it was different. And so, well, I don't know. Seemed like when all the other building materials were being, banned, why not popcorn ceiling? So, and I can't tell you that. I can't answer that, why that kind of was stayed into the 90s, but and it's certainly not the only building material where that's the case, but there is, and part of it again is that there's maybe 11 different laws that apply to asbestos exposure. So maybe, whatever they didn't, maybe asbestos in schools would not allow it, but maybe asbestos in products, it is allowed. So there was a lot of variability depending on how Congress wrote the law, and how, because the executive agencies like EPA only write regulations, so we can only write regulations consistent with the statutes, right? So if a statute specifically exempted something, or specifically told us to do certain things first, that could be part of the reason too. And incidentally, since I've been with the agency, I started with the agency in 1976, right? So since I've been with the agency, the statutes have become much more technically specific. Well, if you look at the Clean Water Act, when I first came to the agency, it was pretty broad, that EPA, the administrator will, make water safer by, 1990 or something. Now, basically, there are court mandates, there are statutory deadlines actually built into the legislation. So it could be that some of the legislation in TSCA, some of the regulation was just basically a matter of getting the timeline before they actually got to something like popcorn ceilings. But again,
So
I'm a scientist, not a lawyer, so that's
right, right. Well, we appreciate the science side of things as well. Is asbestos called the 20 plus year disease because of how long it takes before symptoms show up? We have that kind of goes hand in hand with another question from a little bit earlier, where someone was asking about the claims for mesothelioma, the
right.
commercials that we see on TV.
That is why it has that nickname. And I guess I should have said something a little more about latency period. There's two reasons, at least, for a latency period, that you basically don't have the disease but you maybe had the disease, but it was symptomatic for a long time. And so you may have already had the scarring and the damage occur, but you don't have the symptoms occur. That's one reason. Or it could just be that for whatever reason, the body has a repository for the toxin, and over time it finally takes effect. So oftentimes I think with asbestos, the other one would be, and the third one I guess would be, that you finally reach a threshold of dose. So you may accumulate, so you have an accumulated dose over time. So I think maybe all three of those are in effect, but the latency period is just basically between when you are exposed and when the onset of a particular disease. And we say that we've gotten a little better with precision medicine of not saying the onset of disease, we say the onset of symptoms. Because a lot of times you have the disease, your body hasn't started exhibiting the symptoms. So 20 years is not uncommon at all for between the first exposure, and that would be the other rationale is there's a cumulative exposure. So basically in my business, not to get too much in the weeds, but we have a single exposure, then we have something called aggregate exposure. Aggregate exposure is simply all the different kinds of pathways, the inhalation, ingestion, dermal, nasal, every type of asbestos for one particular contaminant. So you may have been exposed in the drinking water, you may have been exposed in your food, and you may have been exposed by inhaling this over time. For asbestos, as I mentioned, it's probably mainly inhalation. So it's probably not so much an aggregate exposure. Then you have a cumulative exposure where you have more than, so I may have had 3 different types of fibers, plus I may have been exposed to some other contaminants, and I may have had a deficiency of some kind of vitamin or something. So over time, my cumulative exposure has increased, and ultimately I reach a threshold where my body no longer is able to resist the problems associated with it. Again, for asbestos, that may not be the case because the damage occurs almost immediately. So then so now I have a continuous exposure, and there I've had enough damage that maybe in the case of asbestos, my alveoli are no longer able to do oxygen exchange. Even though it's been diminished over time, I haven't reached the threshold where it's noticeable that my respiratory capacity has gone down. So it's kind of a tricky term, but the other thing that happens with asbestos is the co-occurrence of other toxins, particularly cigarette smoke. There've been a lot of studies that show that if you're exposed only to cigarette smoke and you're exposed only to asbestos, you're actually 30 times less or something like that, less than if you're exposed to both. So you have this synergistic effect of co-exposures. All those kind of things kind of take place. And then you have genetic predispositions, for example. So some people are genetically predisposed to resist something for a period of time. So the latency period will vary by individuals, but there's always a latency period associated with asbestos.
Right.
So I know it's a long answer, but that is where that nickname kind of came from.
Right. And there's so many variables, as you're saying, that every situation obviously would be very specific.
Yeah, and we see a lot more, and not just, I mean, all my work, basically, I see a lot more of life stage becomes very important. For example, exposing a pregnant woman or a woman of childbearing age to certain chemicals, for example, endocrine disruptors, for example, is much more damaging if it occurs during a certain life stage than maybe somebody a male over 60 years old, right? That's a very different kind of your body's going to react very differently depending on your life stage. So it's not just time, not just duration, not just intensity of exposure, but also when the exposure actually occurs during a person's life.
Right. So it kind of along those lines as well. Jim asks, before asbestos abatement became a thing, how many people were exposed and tested, and of those, how many developed asbestos, lung cancer, et cetera? I'm not sure if you have any data on that.
It's almost always, that's a great question, Jen. It's almost always episodic that, for example, we have those kinds of data for Libby. We have those kinds of data maybe for shipbuilders and things like that, where maybe the Navy did a good job of, but it varies by, again, they're almost always retrospective epidemiological studies. And so something, in other words, you see something really bad happen, and then you'll go back and retrospectively try to reconstruct what the exposures were. There are not a lot of studies for asbestos that are progressive, where the person is not exposed, and then along the way you find out they're exposed. You're kind of accidental. But most of the times we have to reconstruct that from historical data, occupational data, those types of things. That's the other thing about asbestos, is that most of the data that we have are occupational scenarios.
Okay, I think that about covers all of our questions, Dr. Vallero. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And realtors, if you have specific questions, please feel free to call the legal hotline, 803-772-5206. This webinar has been recorded and archived on screaltors.org/webinar. It will also be on YouTube, and we will share the slides with you. And I think that about wraps it up.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is if you have any specific question about a particular law or regulation, and they do vary in their requirements, I'm happy to put you in touch with the person at EPA that has much more expertise about that than I do.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Vallero. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.